how much do you think an average Czech student coming through the education system, how much would they know about Stanislavsky? Would they know anything?
I think they would. I think they're familiar with it. It depends on the approach of the acting department, if it's, let's say, the classical acting department or the alternative acting department or our acting department. There's definitely a familiarization with him, but again, it's a question of which version of Stanislavsky they encounter, because the versions that are here are all relatively old translations, and I think there's some that the originals here are not colored as much by the communist regime that later came in, but there is a limited amount of exposure, but I don't think there's any sort of fascination with or in-depth knowledge of Stanislavsky.
So if a student was familiar with My Life in Art, for example, would that be a version translated directly from Russian, or would it be based on Hapgood or someone else's is it a translation of a translation?
Right, as far as I know, these are translations from Russian. And it's interesting because I used some Stanislavsky quotes and in my work, and I have a translator who's working translating into Czech. So we had a question of whether or not we were going to translate the English version into Czech or look at the Czech version already and use that. And we looked into the Czech version, and in some ways it's very different than the original or the English translation. It's very different than the English translation. So we said to ourselves, it's as if they're two different Stanislavskys speaking about similar things, but not quite the same things. They seem to have the same opinion, but they're talking about different things. So the issue of translation is an interesting one, because that's key in terms of how you understand Stanislavsky.
So a student comes into an institution such as Durham, and maybe they're an acting student. How much then, at the beginning of their course, maybe in that first year, how much does Stanislavsky feature in what they learn? Is it a central part of their training?
It's hard for me to say exactly about this, because it's not so much in our department. There's not so much of Stanislavsky about in our department. There are general acting-wide, theater faculty-wide courses where they discuss theater theory, they discuss different theorists, teachers, methods, approaches. I know that in the beginning there's a text which is quite an old text, and it's by Jaroslav Vostrý, and it's sort of like a study manual in a sense, that he processed a lot of Stanislavsky. He processed a lot of sources around Stanislavsky, I don't know, maybe in the 70s or no, I think in the 80s. And so it's a second-hand telling of Stanislavsky, of his basic concepts, basic ideas. So they're exposed to that, let's say.
Is this the kind of how to be an actor manual?
A little bit, yes. It's about how to be a good actor. But then here, because a lot of the training is very specific to who's leading the year. It's a kind of atelier system here. So you have one actor or one director who's in the traditional acting departments who's leading the year. So he's responsible basically for their whole acting training. So his approach will define their approach. If he chooses or she chooses to really emphasize Stanislavsky, then he can or she can. It depends, because I think in some of the more classical department, or the classical department here, it's very much geared towards commercial or professional work. So that being the priority, there's not maybe necessarily that much exploration in terms of Stanislavsky.
But in the teaching, do you think that Stanislavsky is looked at as a theory or as a practical approach? Is it more popular when looked at theoretically here? Difficult question.
It is a difficult question. In our department, I can speak for our department, I think it's more theoretically that he's referred to when we talk about some of these concepts. In some ways practically, but not very much.
So how much, as an actor yourself, how much do you think most professional actors in Czech theatre, do they think about Stanislavsky in their work? Do they use Stanislavsky at all, or is it considered to be something from the past that is no longer relevant?
I think it's a lot now more about the past. It's the kind of thing that, I remember once I was just looking at it again and I happened to have it around. Maybe it was a little bit kind of snooty of me to bring the book into the theatre or something. But I don't know, maybe I was reading it for some other reason. And they're like, oh yes, Stanislavsky, I read that a long time ago, I remember that. So it's something that's foundational, definitely, but I don't think it's something that's alive and current or refreshed for many professional actors.